I'm trying to run a 50 amp circuit to my barn that is 400 feet. I have checked the voltage drop and looks like I would need to use a 4.0 aluminum. The problem I am running into is there is no 50 amp breaker with lugs big enough to handle 4.0 alum. Any ideas?
1. Is the 50 amp circuit a feeder circuit for a sub-panel to be installed in the barn, or will the 50 amp circuit just be a single branch circuit?
This circuit is coming from the main home panel and is a 200 amp service. There will be a panel in the barn with breakers. Mostly 110 plugs and lights and one 100 volts water heater. Number 220 circuits, i.e. welders, etc. I wanted to install a 50A breaker in main panel to feed barn panel, but breaker lug not big enough for 4.0 alum.
1. So this will be a brand new sub-panel located in the barn, fed by a 50 amp double pole breaker in the main 200 amp panel, correct? 2. Are you planning on running this underground or overhead?
Yes, that is correct. The service to the barn will be underground and in conduit.
1. According to my calculations, I'm coming up with 20 aluminum cable and not 40. Code recommends a max of a 3% voltage drop. Using 240 volts with a 50 amp feed at a distance of approximately 400 feet results in a 2.3% voltage drop or 234.6 VAC at the end of the circuit. You can use 40 Al as that will work fine, but it is overkill and a more costly solution. 20 Al is all that you would need for this run. 2. At your main electrical panel you could install a couple of feet of 6 AWG stranded copper or 4 AWG stranded Al for the 50 amp breaker. Either of wire sizes are rated for a 50 amp feeder breaker. At the main panel, use either of this size. If using the 4 AWG aluminum, make sure the 50 amp breaker is rated for Al wiring. You can install a splice box near the main 200 amp panel and use insulated piercing connectors as shown in the pic and link below to transition from the breaker feeder wire over to the 20 Al underground cable. These will accommodate both copper and aluminum wires. This will allow you to install the smaller 6 AWG copper or 4 AWG Al to the 50 amp feeder breaker. http://www.mersupply.com/ilsco insulation piercing connector IPC4020.html3. If you are planning on using gray PVC electrical conduit, you can use SCH40 or 80, SCH40 is less expensive. If using PVC, the feeder circuit to the barn needs to be a 4-wire circuit, 2 hots, 1 neutral and 1 equipment grounding conductor. At the main panel, you will need an equipment grounding bar to connect the equipment grounding conductor to. The equipment ground wire if using PVC needs to be either 10 AWG stranded copper or 8 AWG, stranded aluminum 4, if you are planning on running rigid metal conduit, then no need for a separate equipment grounding conductor, since the rigid metal conduit acts as the equipment ground. You will still require 2 hots and 1 neutral. If using rigid metal conduit, and removing the concentrics in either the main and or sub-panels, you will need bonding bushings at each and bond accordingly to the respective equipment ground bars. 5. Since the sub will be located in a separate building, the sub-panel needs to be a main breaker panel and not a main lug panel. The main breaker in the sub will act as the means of disconnect. Purchase or install a main breaker panel with a 50 amp main breaker. 6. At the barn sub-panel, the neutral needs to float and remain isolated from the metal panel enclosure. This means do not install the main copper bonding jumper strap or the green metal grounding screw at the sub-panel neutral bus bar. 7. The sub-panel will require a separate equipment ground bar to connect any bare copper ground wires to, such as Romex, as well as the grounding electrode conductor and equipment grounding conductors. You will also require a minimum of 1. 1/8 feet ground rod or possibly 2. 2 8-foot ground rods at the barn. The ground rod resistance must be less than 25 ohms, thus possibly second ground rod may be required. 8. When connecting the branch circuits at the sub, only the white neutrals land on the neutral bus bar and the bare coppers land on the equipment ground bar. No exceptions here. Therefore, purchase an equipment grounding bar at the sub sufficient for any future growth. Do not mix neutrals with grounds at the sub. Thank you very much for the excellent rating as well as the bonus. Much appreciated. If you have any other questions or run into any problems, just come back and reply to this question and I'll be more than happy to assist you. No need to create an additional question. Take care and have a great day. Thanks. Kevin.
Great job, Kevin. The splice box will work perfect. I wasn't sure about using smaller wire to feed larger 2.0. This service at any time probably won't pull 15 amps, but wanted to make sure. I do have one last question. I was planning on pulling 3 wires and then double ground at the sub panel. What can't you bond neutrals and grounds to same bus?
1. It is an electrical code requirement that at the sub-panel the neutral conductor must float or remain isolated from the panel's metal enclosure. The neutral and the grounds can only come in contact at the main electrical panel and never at a sub-panel. The neutral is the return conductor and can only return back at the main panel. If the neutral and grounds come in contact at a sub-panel, it will create a potential safety issue. Why isolate the neutral in a sub-panel? By code, the neutral for a residential installation is only bonded to the ground at the main service panel. At all other points throughout the house, there is no connection between the bare, or green, grounding conductor and the white neutral conductor. Under normal conditions, the grounding conductor carries no current. If you bond the neutral and the ground at the sub-panel, stray currents from the neutral return could go through the equipment ground on the electrical devices fed from this sub-panel. But if you isolate the neutral and the ground at the sub-panel, stray currents would go back to the main panel and to the service ground. 2. If you will be using PVC conduit, the feeder circuit must be 4 wires, i.e. 2 hots, 1 neutral and 1 equipment ground. Another way to think about this is that anytime you connect 2 panels together, these are considered as equipment and they must be grounded or bonded together. If using metal conduit, then no need to run a 4th wire, since the metal conduit acts as the equipment ground. Kinda similar when using Romex, all Romex has a bare copper to ground the receptacles, switches, light fixtures, etc. Since these are all equipment as well, the bare Romex copper is also an equipment grounding conductor. The ground at the ground rods is a grounding electrode conductor and not an equipment grounding conductor. These are 2 different required forms of grounding.
I have changed the service and had a couple of questions. I have decided to change the distance of the service from 425 feet to 525 feet. TE service will still be 240 volts/50 amps, and if I calculated the voltage drop correctly, I will need to use 30 aluminum. My questions are, does it need to be in PVC conduit or can I direct bury? If in PVC conduit, do you have an idea on diameter to handle the wiring? I am planning to bury at a depth of 24 inches. What size wire would I need to pull for the ground, and is the ground run inside the conduit or out?
1. I'm also coming up with 30 al on my calculations for 240V at 50 amps with a run of 525 feet. This results in a 6-volt voltage drop, which is less than the recommended 3%, therefore 30 al is good to go for this distance. Therefore, you will require 2 hots and 1 neutral as the feeders from the main panel, all 3 wires being 30 al. 2. The equipment ground wire, if using PVC, needs to be either 10 AWG stranded copper or 8 AWG stranded aluminum. This will bond the main and the sub-panel together. Yes, if using PVC, the equipment ground is run inside the PVC conduit along with the 3 feeder conductors. Tape 1 hot as black, the second hot as red, the neutral as white, and the equipment ground as green on both ends. 3. If using PVC, for a T of 330 als and 1.18 AWG stranded aluminum, the calculator shows a 2-inch diameter PVC. You can use either Schedule 40 or Schedule 80 gray electrical PVC, but I would recommend School 40 since it is much cheaper than School 80. If using the 4 separate conductors, minimum PVC size in diameter is 2 inches, 2 inches. However, I always recommend to increase it by 1 additional size and make it 2.5 inches. This makes it much easier to pull the wires. 4. The ground rod conductor from the sub-panel to the ground rod at the barn will need to be 6 AWG stranded copper. 5. For burying the PVC, you will only need to bury it 18 inches below grade level and not 24 inches. You can bury at 24 inches, but then more trenching and or digging to do. 6. You can either install the conductors in PVC or do a direct burial using quadruplex type underground cable. If using the underground quadruplex, then no need for conduit. I would recommend using conduit though. If using regular single conductors, they need to be rated as type THWN. THWN is wire rated for moisture conditions. Even though the conductors may be protected if you use PVC, the cables still need to be rated as THWN for wet/moisture conditions. 7. Since you are running a long distance such as 525 feet, you will most likely need an underground weatherproof box, called a handhole in the electrical construction industry, along the way, or you can stub up from the ground and install a NEMA 3 rated outdoor rated weatherproof splice box and mount it on a treated wooden post and then go back to underground for the remainder of the run. If splicing, you would need either the piercing connectors as I mentioned last week, or you can use split bolts. Not recommended on splicing underground, best to use a treated wooden post for that. The handhole boxes can just be used as a pull box. Just make sure they are rated for AL. Unless you can purchase the conductors or the underground feeder cable in 525 foot lengths, then no need for the splice box. Here is a link if you decide to use an underground handhole box as a pull box. These can also be ordered at your local electrical supply store. Just wanted to give you an idea as to what they look like. http://shop.chapmanelectric.com/vaults-handholes.html. Hope this helps. Thank you for using JustAnswer. Steve. Here is a link if you decide to use an underground handhole box as a pull box. These can also be ordered at your local electrical supply store. Just wanted to give you an idea as to what they look like. http://shop.chapmanelectric.com/vaults-handholes.html. Thanks. Kevin.
If you have a home improvement or appliance question and want to chat with an expert now, visit justanswer.com/ythi.